Thank you very much indeed, Mukesh, for that introduction. About halfway through, actually, I was hoping that the anti-embarrassment filter on my camera was working there. I'm not certain I recognize many of the things that you said about me there. I wanted to start, this is a fireside chat, so you and I are sort of chatting with one another this afternoon, rather than me delivering a speech as such. I wanted to check, though, first of all, whether you're feeling all right, because I didn't catch the whole of that last panel, but I did hear you say that you didn't have much to say, which made me worry that you're not feeling very well. I hope you're okay, Mukesh.
I'm absolutely all right, Philip. The beauty about chairing the panel is you don't have to do anything, just sit over there as a figurehead and leave the difficult job to my IFA colleague Pranav, who was moderating the panel.
Okay, fine. I heard some very interesting comments at the end there about the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 and where we are at the present moment. I think I'd like to broaden our chat a little bit away from just focusing on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. There's been so much focus on those in the last couple of years. I heard one comment from Jonathan Culver, which I massively agree with, and that is that there's been very little attention on traditional international tax matters over the last couple of years. And I would completely agree with Jonathan on that whilst the OECD has been so focused on developing Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, there's been very little going on issues about resolving disputes around the interpretation of tax treaties, updating other provisions of tax treaties, dealing with dispute resolution. We mustn't forget that the underlying issues that started the whole discussion of international tax 100 years ago was ensuring that taxation did not become a barrier to cross-border trade and investment, the movement of persons, whether for work or for study, and the tax treaties were developed very much with those objectives in mind. It was accepted that there was a possibility of double taxation and that could operate as a significant barrier. And so the task that was given to the original sort of 4 economists back at the League of Nations 100 years ago was what are the causes of this international double taxation and how do we relieve that? And that has been largely forgotten over the last 10 years. I'd say probably since shortly after the last economic crisis in 2008, so much focus has been given on international tax avoidance, particularly tax avoidance by multinationals, a small number of typically high-tech multinationals, that a lot of the basic problems have been forgotten about there. So perhaps we can chat a little bit, you and I, Mukesh, more broadly about some of those other issues that have disappeared from the agenda. In advance of today, you sent me a couple of questions, and one of them was if I had a clean slate, learning what we now know about the Pillar 1 and I guess Pillar 2 process as well, what would your starting point be for designing a tax system to tax digital income? And that was one of the questions that you asked me to address. I guess one would always answer a question about the starting point with the old Irish story that somebody is in Cork and they ask directions and say, how do I get to Dublin from here? And the local says, oh, if I were going to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here in the first place. And I guess it's exactly the same with international tax, one wouldn't necessarily want to start from where one did start, or even from where we are now. What might be the starting point in the light of what we now know about the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 process? I think I'd make 3 points in answer to that, and then Mukesh, you can respond to those if you like, or push me on to another question. The first point is, I think in any approach to reform, you have to start by an unblinkered, open approach to identify what the real problem is in the starting position there. You can't start from assuming this is the solution. Now, how do we fit it to solve the problem? You've got to identify what the problem is, what the scale of the problem is, and you've got to do that in a very unblinkered fashion. If, for example, you come to the conclusion that the real problem is the problem that the US international tax system has become dysfunctional since the 1990s, then however unpalatable it is to say that, you've got to say that's the problem. Because if you don't identify that as the problem, and at least superficially, when you look at the large multinationals in the tech sector that have these issues of double taxation, many of them are US-headed groups. So at least there's a sort of smoking gun that suggests that maybe the problems start with the US international tax system, and maybe they have not actually been resolved by the Tax and Jobs Act in the US there. So you've got to start from an unblinkered approach. Also, if you decide that the fundamental problem is that many developing countries are heavily reliant upon corporate income taxes, and they are not able to collect sufficient of those taxes, partly because of lack of information, partly as a result of lack of training, and partly because they are offering too many tax incentives. And the tax incentives are dangerous for those countries, particularly when they come with guarantees of stabilization. Then you've got to identify that as the problem and deal with it. So first point I'd make is that what was not done in either the OECD BEPS 1 or BEPS 2 project was really to start with a proper analysis of the problem and then move to the solution, rather than to start with, we've got some solutions that we have on the table, let's see whether they'll fit the problems there. Second point is to learn from previous experience with other projects that have been worked in the international tax field, and to see what difficulties they ran into. I remember after the harmful tax competition project, Mukesh, you're too young to remember this, but in the late 1990s, the OECD had a project on harmful tax competition, which ran into terrible difficulties with the change of the US administration in 2000. And then there was real uncertainty whether the incoming Bush administration was going to follow it up. And the project had to sort of shift away from harmful tax competition into exchange of information, and became effectively the Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information there. I remember talking to Jeffrey Owen not long, I guess in sometime into the 2000s, before he stepped down from the OECD. He said the one thing that he had learnt about this is that you've got to be aware of the US political cycle and the US political process. If you're working your tax reforms through the OECD, then you've got to be aware of the dominant impact of the US political system and the US cycle. My goodness me, haven't we seen that again repeated in the context of particularly Pillar 2, but also Pillar 1? Where are we? I mean, first of all, the project effectively had to go into sort of mothballs for the best part of a year over the time of the US election, when Trump was approaching the election and effectively asked that the project shouldn't move ahead until the election outcome came up with the safe harbor proposals, which weren't going to be acceptable, and effectively the project stalled other than sort of backroom work. Only after the Biden administration took power, settled in, decided that they weren't going to support that they were going to support the project, only then could work really push ahead to take the project ahead. And then a year plus had been lost, and there's a huge rush to try to get the project completed. But now, what have we got at the moment? We've got a problem that the US Congress is deadlocked effectively between the political parties. There isn't sufficient support in the Senate to get a 2/3 majority if that's needed. Even within the House of Representatives, the two parties are locked, and it looks doubtful that Pillar 1 will be able to go through. And we know that the recent tax reforms in the US did not make sufficient changes to GILTI to make GILTI compatible with the Model 2 rules. So we're fundamentally caught up again in the US political process. And that's a lesson that should have been learnt from the OECD 20 years ago. So that would be my second comment. My third comment is a much broader one. And that is, given what we've seen of the OECD's work on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, given this US dominance, it's time that we change the international tax architecture. It's so absolutely obvious that the OECD is not the right body, whether it's the OECD itself or the inclusive framework. It's not the right body to take ahead supposed reforms of international tax for all sorts of reasons. It has heavy baggage from its previous commitment to certain principles. It is still dominated by the small central group of OECD member countries, albeit through the inclusive framework, there is some participation, but it's not the same as an institution that was set up to give equal involvement from all countries. It still has this consensus approach, which on the one hand sounds like a very good idea to get everybody on board. But the other side to a consensus, the other side of the coin, is that it gives blocking power to one country. And if that country is one like the US that's effectively willing to use that blocking power, then progress only goes ahead at the speed at which that country permits progress there. And that's what's happened here as well. You know, Mukesh, that I've been a strong supporter for many years of a new international tax architecture through the UN. And I'll be spending much of next week in Geneva at the UN Committee of Experts. Not that I think that the current Committee of Experts is the international tax structure that we need, but we need to move ahead on establishing a new international tax architecture. The OECD was never set up to be the leading body on international tax. It was never intended to be the leading body. The UN, after the Second World War, set up a tax commission, which would have been the continuation of the work in the League of Nations in the 1920s and 30s. But it ran into various difficulties in what was perhaps the most important decision in international tax in the last 100 years. The UN wound up that tax commission. And in the gap that resulted, the OECD slipped into that gap. Okay, the OECD has done a very good job, arguably, in sort of carrying the baton. If you see it as a sort of relay race, they've carried the baton for almost 50 years. But now is time. We need to have a mature international tax institution with all countries participating properly on an equal basis, and that is so massively overdue. So, long answer to what was your first question on the agenda that was sent to me, Mukesh. There, do you want to come back, or other members of the panel come back? Or
I want to, actually. We want to finish as many questions as possible. Philip, your comment on UN laying down the new architect is certainly music to ears. Insofar as Mr. Das is concerned on the panel, he's the Indian Competent Authority and also happens to be India's member. I just had one comment to make, which is increased reliance of corporate tax revenues by emerging markets. Fortunately, India finds itself in a sweet spot. I couldn't have made this statement 5 or 7 years back, because our share of non-corporate tax revenues has seen a surge as a result of increased compliance and digitization. And our GST of 2017 is also yielding a good outcome. But I think those are some lessons for the other emerging economies, but particularly the African continent, to run. You mentioned about the problem statement. I also heard from many of our OECD member countries that the market countries' rights for digital taxation is overhyped. What is your view on that?
Just by the way, just responding to your first point, Mukesh, yes, I mean, isn't it absolutely fascinating to see how the composition of the Indian government revenue has changed over the last 15 years or so? The GST, which India was late to adopt, but has been a huge change in terms of central government revenue in India. And by the by, just to sort of go back again to my comments in the first answer to the first question, wouldn't we be looking at a fundamentally different situation internationally if the US had a federal level VAT or GST? And one of the problem issues is that the US at the federal level really can only concern itself with direct tax and not with indirect taxes, which are at the state level. But your question about is the market country's right to tax digital economy, is it overhyped? Yes, in a sense, I think it is overhyped there in two ways. The first way is not to forget, and it links with my previous comments, not to forget the indirect taxes. Indirect taxes, GST, VAT, are taxed on the destination basis. They are collected at the markets, in the market economy, by the government there, and can be used for their own purposes there. So given that you have already a very effective taxation in the market economy, why do you need to give an additional taxing right over profits as well to the market economy? Could one not be collecting the revenue through indirect taxes in a much more effective manner? And the answer, I think, is yes. So why then is there this focus on also giving the market economy a share of tax over the profits as well? I think there are two answers to that. The first answer comes from some of my colleagues at Oxford. I heard Mike Devereux's name being mentioned a little bit earlier. And of course, Mike has focused a lot of attention on destination taxes, the destination-based cash flow tax. And I think stripped of the careful analysis, the main reason that he proposes that is to deal with tax avoidance. If you look at taxation rights as being potentially given to the state of residence or the state of source or the market state, there are problems with both residence and source. It is possible for multinationals to shift the source of income. It is possible for them to choose which is the resident country there. So his argument is that the one factor that is impossible to shift is the location of the customer. Customers will not move around. They are in the market jurisdiction, and a business cannot shift where its customers are. You can do a little bit of cross-border selling, but by and large, you have to sell or provide services where your customers actually are. And so the emphasis on the destination base is to combat tax avoidance. Again, I'd make the same point I made a little bit earlier. That's focusing on avoidance, letting the sort of avoidance tail wag the tax jurisdiction prevention of double taxation dog. They are the important elements, and you're focusing again massively on avoidance. But that's one of the reasons that there's been this focus. The other reason, I think, is again going back to the point I made earlier, that many developing countries are much more reliant upon corporate income tax than developed countries. And India, your figures, Mukesh mentioned how corporate income tax is becoming less significant in India than it has in the past. And again, one has to ask the question, well, why is that? What are the problems that developing countries have? And that's, I think, an issue of looking at questions like the existence of tax exemptions, tax incentives, tax holidays, problems of capability to implement the tax, and the need to develop other sources of revenue in those countries rather than just leaving it to a new taxing right. So long answer to your question, I think they are overhyped.
Philip, you mentioned about the US tax policy driving much of the discussions on the two-pillar solution. So do you accept it that to achieve the goal of the two-pillar solution, now the world has to heed to an overarching importance of the US domestic policy?
I think I probably put it another way around, actually, there, which is we're not going to get an effective agreement around Pillar 1 unless the US is on board. It's being phrased at the moment in the phraseology of a critical mass. That I understand critical mass to actually mean if the US is on board, fine. If it's not on board, forget it. Pillar 1 will not achieve the critical mass there. Now, will the US be on board? I have no idea. the US is presently preparing for midterm elections. Those midterm elections could give Biden sufficient support in Congress to get further reforms through. It's quite intriguing that the biggest issue in the US election doesn't appear to be tax reform. I don't think it ever is in any country. Maybe in my country at the moment, tax reform might actually be significant if there was an election in the near future. The main issue in the US is the abortion debate, Roe and Wade and the Supreme Court. It's quite astonishing that whether or not Pillar 1 goes ahead is indirectly linked to what happens in the abortion debate in the US, which just shows how crazy we are in the situation we've got ourselves into. But I wouldn't speculate about what's going to be the outcome in the US and whether it's going to produce a Congress that will go back and achieve further reforms and will allow Pillar 1 to go ahead. What I will say is that you have to have a plan B. And one of my criticisms of the OECD would be that they have a tendency to say there is no plan B. It has to be the two pillars, or there'll be anarchy. There won't necessarily be anarchy. There will be digital service taxes like the equalization levy in India. The key thing is to make arrangements to ensure that those digital service taxes are coordinated, that they don't result in double taxation, and they operate in a way that ensures that they are credited in countries like the US, and that they are not incompatible with tax treaties. So you have to have a fallback alternative. Again, I'll come back to the UN. We have the advantage that the UN has been working on an alternative in the form of Articles 12A and now 12B of the OECD model. So we have the fallback position, which we need if Pillar 1 doesn't go ahead because of US political developments that mean that we never get the critical mass to support Pillar 1.
Philip, where we stand today is that the model rules for Pillar 2 have been published, while Pillar 1 is still a work in progress. It's for the OECD an inclusive framework to decide if they're going to push the Pillar 2 button first. However, in your view, if that happens, is it like putting the horse before the cart?
Well, it does look as if a number of countries are going to go ahead with Pillar 2 in the short term, even while Pillar 1 is still, so the jury is still out on Pillar 1. The UK, for example, has published draft legislation to implement Pillar 2. We're not the only country that seems to be preparing legislation on Pillar 2. Switzerland, I think, is also quite well advanced, and I've heard of other countries that are working on the legislation. The two pillars are not tied together in the way that a horse and cart are tied together. You're talking about, is it putting the horse before the cart? The horse and the cart have to be tied together. If you had the horses running off and the cart wasn't tied to them, there wouldn't be much point. Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are only, in a sense, politically linked, as opposed to a part of the same solution. There are some countries that are much more favorable to Pillar 1 than Pillar 2, some that are much more favorable to Pillar 2 than Pillar 1. And the big question is, if Pillar 1 fails, does that mean that Pillar 2 has to fail as well? And the answer, I think, is no. Pillar 2 could stand completely on its own. But on its own, is Pillar 2 really a good suggestion, a good proposal to deal with not just taxation of the digital economy, but taxation of large multinationals? The complexity of Pillar 2 is so terrifying. The cost to businesses to implement Pillar 2, the overall result that may come from Pillar 2 must lead one to ask, is this really an idea whose time will never actually come? Countries may introduce these taxes, but then perhaps regret and maybe withdraw them at a later date because of the sheer complexity of implementing. You mentioned the model rules that were introduced last December. I think I've told you this, Mukesh. In all good faith, I sat down last December to read those model rules. When I came to about page 5, I wrote on the top of my copy, I am completely lost. And by the time I'd reached about page 10, I actually wrote at the top of my copy, I've lost the will to live. There's something fundamentally wrong with an approach to taxation that requires the sort of complexity that the model rules evidences. We're talking about large multinationals. They have skilled staff, they have systems, there will be a cost to implement it, but really, is it worth the effort at the end of the day? You and I were at a meeting, I think, in Berlin, at IFA in Berlin, where someone had done some research on the possible impact of Pillar 2 on Germany. And on one approach, Pillar 2 would increase German tax revenues by about, certainly less than 1%, about 0.5%. That was on a fairly advantageous assumption. Other assumptions resulted in the actual impact in revenue in Germany on something like 0.2, 0.3%. So is it really worth all that effort for that sort of impact?
Philip, many experts have, my last question, expressed a view that the Pillar 2 as it stands is expected to create huge conflict with the current treaty network. What are your views on that? And my final question is, with all the challenges that you highlighted, what is the Philip Baker pill for the tax world?
Well, the Philip Baker pill is very easy. Keep on attending IFA meetings and conferences like this, and listen to all the very interesting ideas that people are bringing forward. Now, I'll come back to the Philip Baker pill in a moment. Can I just check, time-wise, we've got about 5 minutes, haven't we?
Yes, unless the organizers here switch me off, she's signaling that we still have 5 more minutes. Okay, fine.
I've forgotten about what the first part of your question was, actually. I was focusing
on the potential, the potential conflict which
the tax
Pillar 2
treaty,
will create with the domestic law, tax treaty.
Okay, I've heard the arguments, and they are similar, I guess, to the arguments that were being raised 20 plus years ago about the conflict between CFC legislation and tax treaties. That what you're asking under the Pillar 2 is that under the IRR, you are going to impose tax on profits that arise in subsidiary companies of a group where there is no permanent establishment. And so that's a conflict with tax treaties. I think that there are, and we know that that issue of CFC legislation, where there's a much closer link with the parent company than there may be in the case of the Pillar 2 tax charges. We know that that issue was litigated, and some jurisdictions found that the tax treaty prevailed. Some found that the CFC legislation prevailed. The OECD made changes to the commentary to make it very, very clear that the CFC legislation, the domestic anti-avoidance legislation, should prevail. And we have very clear indications from the inclusive framework that the inclusive framework's position is that the tax charge under Pillar 2 should prevail over a tax treaty. And I've no doubt that that will be reflected in commentary. We also have one very significant change to the OECD model, which has been implemented through the MLI, and that is the savings clause in Article 1. Which provides that effectively a country can tax its residents as if the treaty were not in place. That means that any parent of a group that says you cannot tax us because of the treaty with the jurisdiction where the income is arising but is not being subject to a 15% effective tax, they would have to get over the hurdle of that savings clause. And the savings clause, I think, is the clinching point. If a treaty has that savings clause, it will be extremely difficult to raise that argument. So I've heard the academic arguments on this particular point. As a practical matter, I don't think those arguments will succeed. Again, as a practical matter, I don't think multinationals would be necessarily willing to chance it and challenge a tax charge under Pillar 2 by reliant upon tax treaties. I don't think they would be given a sufficiently high probability of success. They would be definitely flowing against the strong tide, and they would be also flagging up that they were, as a multinational, it's only the very large multinationals that will be impacted by this, they would be flagging up that they have an effective tax rate lower than 15% because of the fact that they have income in jurisdictions where it's subject to a low effective tax. And that's not going to be a positive statement for any multinational to make about itself. So both as a tax technical matter and as a practical matter, I've heard the arguments, but I think that the Pillar 2 charge is going to prevail. And I agree with what the inclusive framework is saying on that point.
Yeah. Philip, in Berlin, in the Vienna University event, you spoke passionately about the OECD priorities, and that some of the key projects such as profit attribution and arm's length principle, which are being insubordinated because of the two-pillar discussion. Would you like to talk about that? Because we often discuss that in the context of our India policy. Where do we stand on profit attribution and arm's length principle?
Well, the context in Berlin was a sort of discussion about what are the real problems of international tax. And I think that there's a long agenda of problems. And that agenda is actually being ignored to a large extent at the moment because of this focus on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Delegates to the OECD, they have other commitments in their own countries. There's only a certain amount of time that can be spent on these international tax multilateral discussions. And the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 discussions are crowding out other matters. And there's a long list, and you may have your own list, Mukesh, and other members of the panel may have other thoughts about what should be on that list. I would say that on the agenda of that list are issues such as a desperate need to improve the resolution of cross-border tax disputes. MAP is simply not working in many cases. And we know that arbitration is a solution that is only acceptable to certain countries. And we need to find some way that is acceptable more broadly to remedy the problems that MAP creates. We are not focusing enough attention on the issue that I've highlighted several times, and that is tax incentives, tax holidays granted by developing countries and the negative impact that has. We're not focusing enough I would say, on the whole issues of taxpayers' rights. We have developed almost sort of unobserved, because everyone's been focusing on the BEPS projects. We've developed this huge network of arrangements for exchange of information, and huge amounts of data is now being supplied under automatic exchange of information, under the CRS system, under FATCA, under the DAX system in Europe. Do we have sufficient safeguards for that data? Isn't there a huge danger still of hacking or loss of danger? And then there are other sort of more detailed technical issues that are not being examined on the agenda. We haven't spoken about this, but one of the approaches to the taxation of the digital economy is to develop the concept of a significant digital economic presence, or a significant economic presence there, to get around the problem that the permanent establishment concept is very much a physical world concept. It's not very difficult to develop a significant economic concept definition. It would be based on the size of the customer base in a country and the amount of business that's being carried out, transactions in that country. But the big problem when you have a significant economic presence is, how do you determine the profit that is attributable? And that takes us back to effectively the failure of the OECD project on attribution of profits to permanent establishments 20 years ago. The AOA, it's totally wrongly named. It's not the authorized OECD approach. It's an approach that the OECD put forward and was generally not accepted other than by a small number of countries. And the difficulty that the OECD has is in accepting failure and saying, right, let's start again. Let's go back and reconsider this question. Because if we had an alternative approach to the attribution of profits to a permanent establishment stroke significant economic presence, we could use that in our traditional established tools of international taxation. We would expand permanent establishment to cover significant presence, and then we would use some sort of, probably a formulary approach in order to attribute the profits and to have them taxed. And that would be normal income taxation of those profits, determined in a way that would then make it creditable and would avoid double taxation. And I have many regrets in my life there. One of my regrets is that 20 years ago, Richard Collier and I wrote the general report for IFA Amsterdam on the attribution of profits, and we raised lots and lots of problems about the AOA. Nobody listened to us, never do listen to IFA general reporters. But one of the things that we spoke about at that time was, one solution would be to develop generally accepted principles of management accounting for tax purposes. If you think about it, every business, every large business, uses management accounts to decide whether a particular branch is profitable or not. And that's true whether it's a physical branch or a digital branch. You need to know, if you're a digital company and you're operating into a country, is it profitable? Are we charging the right amount? And you use management accounts for that purpose. I deeply regret that Richard and I didn't try to start developing some generally accepted tax principles of management accounting for that. I even dug out my old MBA textbooks on management accounting from my MBA at the London Business School to see whether we could use those, and then we sort of ran out of time there. I'm concerned about the time and that it's getting very late. And I know that we've got some very important activities coming up over the next couple of days, because the T20 World Cup is starting, and everyone wants to make certain that you've got time to get yourself in position to watch the matches there. But I will just take up one last point. You asked me a bit earlier about, what's my pill. I don't have the answers to many of these questions. I have possible suggestions, but they may not be the right answers. I don't pretend to know how to tax the digital economy. What I think I do know is this, and that is, if you have the wrong institutions asking the wrong questions, you are very unlikely to get the right answer. And it's a bit of a cop-out, but I have to say, I would start with institutional reform as the most critical issue there. If we keep on with the OECD supposedly leading through an inclusive framework, which is really not a satisfactory substitute for a proper international tax organization, we're going to continue to get ourselves going down blind alleys.
Philip, just wanted to wind up with issues on tax which are close to your heart. This is UK. The UK budget has received unprecedented importance this year, not just in the UK, but outside the world as well. One of the things that we often joked about in India was a rollback budget. If budget proposals were presented, but they were rolled back. We've seen that happening in UK as well with your new chancellor. Would you just like to share with us the highlights of the UK budget and how it is impacting the world?
First of all, just to be clear, this wasn't a budget. In principle, we are supposed to have a budget later in the year. This was a fiscal event, and it was specifically a fiscal event. And that was one of the problems, because if there is a proper budget, then we have an independent Office of Budget Responsibility, whose job is, it's sort of, they do what it says on the tin. They are the Office of Budget Responsibility. They can call out an irresponsible government and say, this is an irresponsible budget, the figures don't add up. And one of the faults was that the Chancellor stood up. It was known that he was going to announce a package of measures to assist with the fuel crisis, and that was expected. It was also anticipated that he would roll back some of the tax increases that the former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, had announced, which were going to pay for the NHS because of the backlog resulting from COVID. But he went further than that, and he announced a series of tax reductions amounting to 40 or 50 billion pounds of cutting in government revenue. For example, it had been announced that our corporate debt was to rise to 25%. He announced that change, which businesses have been planning on and factoring in, that was not going to go ahead, and that we are going to stick with our current 19% corporate tax rate, and in time potentially have further tax reductions on the corporate tax side. He announced a general 1% reduction in the rate of personal income tax. The general rate, the basic rate of 20%, was to go down to 19% from next April. He announced that there was going to be an unlimited number of special zones where there would be additional tax incentives. So these huge numbers of tax cuts announced at a non-budget without any clear indication of where the government was going to make up the figures. How are they going to make up the government revenue other than by some supposed growth? And the markets didn't accept it. The whole point about an Office of Budget Responsibility report is to assure the market that the budget is responsible. And the chancellors had to back down and say, oh yes, well, I will bring forward further details of how I'm going to balance the books. And the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, will give a report. But at the moment, those further details are still not going to be available until I think the 21st of October. And with the uncertainty in the market, it's not even particularly clear that the markets will let him wait until that. You add that onto a general political problem in our country, which is the Liz Truss has taken over as Prime Minister. She lost the election amongst Conservative MPs. The majority of Conservative MPs wanted Rishi Sunak. They didn't want Liz Truss. Then it went to the membership of the Conservative Party, and for whatever reason, that membership voted for Liz Truss. So they've put in place a Prime Minister who has the confidence of less than half of her own MPs. Yeah. And yesterday evening, there was a meeting of the 1922 committee, which is the Parliamentary Conservative Party. All reports from that were that it was sort of blood on the floor, that there was absolutely no support for Liz Truss. And now where we are is already one of the tax changes that Kwasi Kwarteng announced has had to be withdrawn, and that was the ending of the 45% tax bracket there. He's had to drop that, and so we will continue with the 45% tax bracket. There is talk about the possibility that he will have to withdraw further of the tax cuts. If that happens, he probably has to go as Chancellor. If he has to go as Chancellor, the question is whether Liz Truss can survive. And there are serious questions now as to whether Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, whether either of them are viable to continue in office. And that's an appalling situation to have a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who don't have the support of the majority of their own party in Parliament. I'm not certain how it's going to work out. The Conservative Party knows that if they split, or if they there was so little support that they had to go for a general election, they'd be massacred. So they've got to try to hold on for the next 2 years. But the prospect of a Prime Minister who doesn't have the support of her own party in Parliament lasting for 2 years is very, very unlikely. I'm not certain that I know what's going to happen. It may be that the Conservative Party simply has to bite the bullet, and somebody's got to go to Liz Truss and say, you have no credibility, go. In which case, could they just say, well, in that case, Rishi Sunak was the other candidate, he steps in. Would he want it in those circumstances? I mean, effectively, what we're deciding is who is going to be the Conservative Prime Minister who loses the next election. And you can see a number of Conservative politicians lining themselves up to be the leader of the party after the next election. And the really scary thing is that one of those people who's lining himself up is Boris Johnson, which I find very scary indeed there. I don't know whether that's answered your question there, and I should say that was all entirely personal comment from me there.